everything works and no one gets hurt. We're going to have a conversation between Vin and I, but you're encouraged to drop questions in the Q&A as we go along. And well, let's get started. Vin, maybe if you could just talk a little bit about yourself, but before you do, I'll just mention that the first one of these webinars was done on St. Patrick's Day, and Jane Lappin, coming from Boston, asked her if she was going down to the St. Patrick's Day parade and celebrating. And then coincidentally, the next one was on Patriots Day in Boston, which is when they run the Boston Marathon. And I mentioned those two to you, and you responded that you had actually run in the Boston Marathon. So did you win? Setting a record?
I only set one sort of reaching milestone, which was to actually run the race. And it starts before then, is to qualify. So if you qualify, then you get to decide if you want to run the race of your life or just like sit back and enjoy the show. I'll tell you, if you know the race, it's timed with the baseball game that's going on that same day. And so as the fans are trickling out of the stadium that day, because the game starts at 11, I think, you get to cheer on the runners. I'd much rather be the baseball fan cheering on the runners, I think, than the runner running by.
Well, and we did discover that you spent a lot of your childhood in Boston, Massachusetts as well, or in the suburbs. So you're a Red Sox fan, even though you were born in and around New York City, right?
That's right. Born in Queens. Raised by Yankee fans, revolted, and adopted my dad's team in Boston, and agonized for a few decades before there was actually any success. So that was quite a journey.
Why don't you tell our listeners about your professional background and how you get to be a mobility nerd yourself?
Yeah, so I don't want to go into the deep history here, but I always start off with the fact that I am from a big family. I'm from a family of 8. I'm the oldest of 6 kids. And when you're the oldest of quite a group, you learn things. It's sort of in your DNA to adopt certain practices, leadership skills, I guess. So communication skill is something that you just learn. Not passing the buck and leading by example and crisis communication and all these things get rolled up into your life. And so, as I journeyed through to what was a career path, I saw the need to continue to sort of protect and help. And those are attributes that I had from, very young. So my life of public service is sort of like, it makes sense that I would come from that origin to doing the work that I do today. And to overuse the pun, intersection, I sort of had this opportunity in public sector and in private sector to look at what's happening from an innovation perspective, emerging technologies, and at the same time, that sort of mission to protect and preserve and keep people safe. So that intersects together. And, often you can sort of say, well, you're an innovation person only, and you do it at the expense of these other things. Or you're a safety person only, and, you sort of, that's your first primary thing. I actually think these things not only can coexist, but they complement one another. And, lately, if you look around, right, you notice that one of the big challenges we have is that, we're also sort of bombarded, and the need of our attention and distraction. And so on our roads, when you think about distraction on our roadways, it's interesting how the advent of the sort of the device has happened at a time when distraction is sort of on an increase, and particularly in pedestrians. If you stop at a red light, you look to your left, you look to your right, you look in your rearview mirror, you look at the person crossing the street. Everybody's on their device, it feels like. So what better way to fight sort of that sort of like technological impact or evolution, if you want to call it, with technology that can actually make the road safer. So whether that's in vehicle or roadside or road design, there's a lot of innovation on this side of the equation that can meet the challenges of what we have today.
And so, how did you end up in your governmental roles?
Uh, Interestingly, I worked with or for four transportation secretaries. The first one I worked with was a great person, Rodney Slater, uh, who I was paired with in a weird way at a law firm. And he was the one to really kind of help cut my teeth on the need for transportation. This thing that we take and use every single day that's it's almost invisible to us. You notice it when it doesn't work, is sort of the idea. But he sort of compelled me to understand and look at the need as a service to adopt good transportation that is safe, convenient, affordable, clean, um, because we need to get to our doctor appointments, we need to get to school, we need to get safely to work every single day, get our groceries. So, he passed along that, and I ate it up. And just been blessed over a longer period to have the best set of mentors and peers. When I think about not just the four secretaries, but I think about everyone below that level. I've worked with several fantastic deputy secretaries, undersecretaries, modal administrators, even the folks at the career levels and the career ranks. I have to give a shout out to them because I've learned so much from them as well. But I mean, it's just the type of thing that it's a frothing effect. The more you get into it, the more you get excited about it.
So you have to keep your secretary straight then when you're talking about where you've been and who you've worked with. Um, so the genesis for this conversation, not today's, but having these conversations in a podcast format, came about as a result of my attendance at the Society of Automotive Engineers government and industry meeting. It takes place in every January, and there was a panel that was giving discussion on the future mobility and what lay ahead. And at the end, there was a question raised, and you see this question quite often, and that is, who's at fault when there's a car accident? And how are we going to decide those issues? And I was really surprised by the panel because I don't think they rose to the challenge. I think they gave answers that we hear all too often. And the two that I really had a reaction to, there's 1,000 people in this room. Um, and the first comment that came out was, well, in level two, the human being is always responsible for the accident. And I went, that's not right. Most people that are listening to the show know that I'm a lawyer, and I, that's just not correct. And then the second reaction to this question was, well, how is it going to be developed? This concept of fault and who's right, who's wrong, and another questionable comment came out and said, well, the system's really going to be hard to develop and it's going to take years to do that. And I thought, I'm so tired of hearing that refrain. And so you could ask questions if you were quick enough to the microphone. So I ran around the back of the room and I pointed out that I thought they were wrong on this issue of who's at fault and level two. And just for the audience's purposes, I mean, the way you have to think about level two, um, NHTSA does not say who's at fault. NHTSA simply says in level two, the driver has to remain vigilant. So the driver can take over if warranted. So the duty is to stay aware and be prepared, but it doesn't make you responsible. And there's a big difference between those two concepts. And then from the standpoint of the legal system, I think our legal system, while we have product liability and negligence kind of concepts, um, our legal system is ill prepared for this very rapidly changing environment that these vehicles are being introduced into. And so while we have a body of laws that will work, the court systems are ill prepared to develop um, anything like a body of work that everybody's going to be able to refer to. It takes years for legal precedent to mature. Sometimes it's going to be wrong. Um, and then the regulatory world, which you're much more familiar with, um, that takes quite a while too. And we've had advanced mobility out there for a long time, and I think we're still dealing with the vestiges of the federal motor vehicle safety systems, and it hasn't matured, in my opinion, quickly enough, and that's in part because it's political, and that because it's really hard to do. So, uh, I my call to action on all of these calls is that we need to come together and build a process where we can create a much better environment to look at auto safety, and also deal with the events in an efficient way when things don't work. And we, as you and I were talking and getting ready for this conversation yesterday, well, we came across 4 points that I thought were really, really helpful. And The first one was, what's the role of vehicle safety data? And do we have the right data? And how much of the data is available that we don't use? And then we moved on to the 40,000 deaths per year in motor vehicle accidents. And so we're going to be talking about that a bit more. It's unfortunate, but that number is not changing in any material way. The third topic that I thought we'd talk about is, can we wait for government to provide the solution for safety? Is government really going to be the one that steps up and says, no, now hear ye, here's how it's going to work? And then the fourth one is, how can stakeholders tackle this problem of developing a much safer system for transportation in this advancing mobility world? So let's start off with vehicle safety data, or data in general. The estimated data generation for 2025 ADAS equipped vehicles. We're not talking about level 3, 4, 5. We're just talking about at the ADAS level. It's astronomical how much data is coming off these cars in an hour. And I just want to know if you had any thoughts about this seemingly ironic situation we're in, where we have so much more data coming off the cars, but yet we know so little about how to use that data to advance safety. So, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think it's not native to just automobiles. I think the data challenge that we experience every day is that there is just so much, we're giving off so much of it, we're receiving so much of it. It's just kind of out there floating around us. It really boils down to what is, for whatever the purpose is, what is the right set of data to make something more efficient, to make something safer, to make things cleaner, to whatever, right, the benefit might be. It's understanding, so now you bring it to the vehicle level itself. And um, you're right. Vehicles are, supercomputers essentially coming off the line. They've got so much CPU going on. It feels like that you can't. One would take a step back and think, well, surely you can kind of add the right set of information, put it together, and come up with novel insights as it relates to things like safety. I'm not here to say that manufacturers aren't doing that. I think that they are. I think because, once you achieve that level of safety, once you kind of have that next insight, it improves your product. And in turn, right, when I was growing up, it was Volvo. Volvo was the safest vehicle, in the 80s and 90s, say, right? And I think many of them have seen the value in trying to achieve that increased level. Um, Whether they're doing it in concert, meaning sharing all the same information, or there's certainly DOT, US DOT wants to do their part, and then across the different states, they have their own safety administrators when it comes to this area. Um, but yeah, you start to think about how much is asked for on the federal level, how much is being given off, how much of it is proprietary, right? So we understand we're not going to want the IP, right? That's going to impact the market or impact a specific brand or maker. Um, but yeah, you have to believe that there is, and I think in the sea of all this data, right, at the federal level, we're left trying to do, make our own call on, what's the investment in research and what should it yield, right? And all that gets tied back to Congress and their appropriations and what the purpose is for that, right? But at the same time, is there a mechanism, like I'll just say, like a standing general order, right? That's starts to pick at this idea of, can you share basic fundamental information, and what, does it have to be voluntary, does it have to be mandatory? We're not there yet, but clearly you want to believe that there are insights to be had. I'm sure that there are manufacturers tuning in saying, yes, we're doing this, yes, we're doing that. But that 40,000 figure is incredible. That is two 747s crashing every week, right? And if that were happening, I think we'd all look around and say, well, wait a second, right? This is an epidemic. We need to try and address this in some new way. And I think it's interesting with the advent of, artificial intelligence and the ability to ingest vast amounts of data and, take a new approach to generating these insights. You feel like we're almost there, like we're close enough. It's achievable.
Well, maybe a good case to take a look at is automatic emergency braking, and how much one that has improved safety dramatically. The numbers are really starting to show very positive trend lines about those systems really being helpful to human beings and safety in general. And it seems like automatic emergency braking is actually even getting better with time, where the speed with which it would work in an absolute way is increasing, so that you can actually go faster. And not that you want to do that while you're coming into an automatic braking environment, but it used to be 30 miles an hour, and now many manufacturers are saying they're going to be able to stop cars at 40 and 50. So maybe if you could talk about, was that government mandated, or how did that come about that vehicles now have automatic emergency braking?
You alluded to it kind of at the start, that when it comes to the federal role and when it comes to developing sort of the rules of the road, literally the regulations that are adopted, it takes a lot of time and it gets pushed around, right? So it's not linear in a sense that, we know it's going to take 18 months, that, say Congress wants us to do this, we've been authorized, and now we're going to go and do this thing. Um, it can be prioritized, deprioritized, and overtaken by by other rules that need to happen. And as a result, you can look at something like AEB and say, okay, this is an 18-month horizon. But, again, you said it yourself, politics can get in the way, priorities can get in the way, uh, things move up and down the scale. And before you know it, especially if you're going through a period of sort of flexibility or deregulation, that can be a long time by the time you get out to the other side. And in the case of AEB, it showed promise. The origins, if you actually go and look it up, are, earlier than the year 2000, right? But in luxury vehicles through those early 2000s, it became an attractive feature in the name of safety. And because the data, if you will, it bore out that this increased the safety of your vehicle, uh, more manufacturers started to adopt it. This is all in the absence of a regulation at this point. And so about a year ago, last May, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration finalized a rule requiring manufacturers of light duty um, to adopt by the year 2029. So if you go all the way to the beginning of that arc in the early 2000s when it's in luxury vehicles to 2029, right? That's a longer timeline to get to a mandate. However, uh, prior to the regulation, a good number of OEMs and manufacturers had started to adopt this because they saw the life-saving value, the crash avoidance value of having AEB. And, we didn't quite get there on commercial motor vehicles. Uh, but, I think you're going to have actors that are going to adopt these things because they see the value in it. And that's a case right there. Sometimes, because of the government process, the sector itself needs to adopt their own set of standards and raise their game. This isn't novel. We saw, the precedent set by the aviation industry way back a long time ago. They said, they're due to the risk and wanting to de-risk our sector, we have committed ourselves to adopting a higher standard of security in the aviation sector. And it saves lives. It preserves their brand. It makes it a more meaningful mode of transportation in that regard. It makes it an easy proposition if you're a traveler when you think about those trade-offs.
Well, I think what's astounding is that um, consensus within the automotive industry, along with private organizations like the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, were really some of the primary movers to get this done in a uniform fashion without regulation. Like you just said, it was just recently became a regulation, but all of this was by agreement. Um,
That's
uh,
right.
by manufacturers. And uh, but think about how much more can be done if people that understand how these cars are being built and the problems that the public faces with these issues um, can be solved by better cooperation among people that traditionally are competitors,
Yeah.
as well as dealing with how to do this in somewhat of a uniform way so that at least everybody understands what an automatic emergency braking feature is and how it might work. That 40,000 deaths per year, and we touched on this a little bit. I looked at what is the trend line for commercial um, air travel and how many deaths there are. And it's hard to say there's an average because in one year you can have two
Yeah.
or three of these events, and then next year you may have none. But it seems like the average since 2000 has been somewhere around 200 lives lost in commercial aviation compared to that 40,000 number.
Yeah.
I just spoke at two events. MIT has its annual event, and I spoke at that, and then I spoke at the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety annual meeting last week, and everybody keeps talking about this 40,000 lives lost a year. And I guess it dropped a little bit in 2024, or at least that's what the numbers look like, but not much. And certainly not enough to say, oh, well, look at all the lives we've saved. So, do you have any thoughts on like how we can really make a dent in that 40,000 per year number?
Yes, and this is, my perspective. So first, you're correct. There was a trend line that, if I remember correctly, it showed decrease in fatalities until you get to around the year 2011, 2012, and coincidentally, we've got the distraction era on us, and it starts to climb back up and climbs back up. It spikes around the time of COVID, and there's a number of a lot of research around why that is. And then in the last two plus years, I want to say at 9 or 12 quarters, like you've seen it start to come down. But it's still, one is way too many. And one thing that we would do at DOT is just put thought into where different types of scenarios are exhibiting higher sort of frequency. And I'll give you one in particular was at the intersection. At the intersection of that 40,000, over 25% fatalities happen at an intersection. And so to try to understand that better, our Office of Research that deployed, hundreds of millions of dollars in grant programming to understand what's happening, from a smart perspective. Can you harden or can you make an intersection, enable an intersection to provide more insight into what's actually happening, right? Are they pedestrians encroaching on the right of way? Are they, right? There's a number of different scenarios. And so that's just one case where you can start to slice and dice, right, that big number. The other is in the realm of commercial motor vehicles. I think it was in 2019, there were up over 5,000 fatalities involved large trucks. And then by 2022, that number had started to peak and then had started to come down after that. But I think that was nearly 6,000, right? So you can start to ask the questions around, okay, so what's happening around large trucks and buses in particular that is contributing to this? So one sort of early cut is to look at what that pie represents and then start to really kind of come at it. I think, unfortunately, there's no panacea that says we're going to wave this wand and it's going to provide this solution. And right, because at the end of the day, there's another sliver that part of the contributing factor to a fatality is not wearing your seatbelt or being under the influence of alcohol or drugs or something. The point being, you can try to come at each one of these slivers. If you solve for the intersection piece, if you solve for half of the intersection piece, right, that 26% of 40,000, you can do the math in your head on how many lives that is saved. And on the trucking side, if it's 5,000, I used to go out and I used to tell people all the time, yeah, that's 5,000, it's a number. But, if you look around the room, whether it's directly or one person removed, raise your hand if you know someone who has been a victim of a vehicle fatality. And, everybody knows somebody. So you hear the term cost of doing business thrown around a lot, personal responsibility thrown around a lot. And one thing we were really wanting to understand is how could we adopt technology in a way, whether it's working with the makers to make a better vehicle or helping on the infrastructure side or the road design side to make a safer environment. Because we think that we can really knock that number way down again. One thing I used to take real pride in was as the senior advisor for innovation to the secretary, was thinking on ways to bring and adopt innovation that can help meet what I felt was being exacerbated by technology, by this distraction element, right? So how can we use it as a solution for the future?
Well, I think the interesting dynamic that's going on right now is that cars can sense when drivers have their hand on the phone, and they can do it in two different ways. One, the inward-facing camera is paying attention to how much the driver's paying attention. And one of the I know at least one manufacturer, so I'm assuming all of them are doing this, can sense if that driver has picked up the phone in a nanosecond. I know this because of personal experience. I've had my car tell me the minute I touch my phone and lift it, it will send me a message saying, pay attention. That's scary. It's not scary from the standpoint of it scared me, but I became much more aware of how often I would touch my phone. And in this particular instance, only uh, when the car was in autopilot would this happen. And so the warning you would get is pay attention, and then you would get 3 or 4 of those, and then you'd get the final warning. If you don't pay attention, we're going to disable autopilot for the rest of your ride. And so, like, please don't do that. I need my autopilot. Um, and then I was talking with another automotive engineer who worked for a German manufacturing company, and he said but it's even more sensitive than that. The cars and the phones are communicating with each other so that the car knows where the phone is inside the cockpit and when it's being moved or picked up. So we have this emerging technology that should be able to solve for how to deal with human beings touching their phones when they're driving. We have bigger societal problems. Do you really want to be told you can't touch your phone? Do we really want to make that commitment as members of society? And yet we know that's one of the biggest contributors to unsafe driving. So I lived in New York City for many years, and in New York City, if you pick your phone up just for a second, just pick it up. You don't have to look at it, and you're seen by a police officer. You're getting a ticket, and you're getting points just for touching the phone. Now, that may not be the best way to address the problem, but that it's ironic that technology already has the capabilities, and we're not using it for crash avoidance.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it begs a broader question, and this is actually something that I credit Secretary Buttigieg with really wanting to come at, which was let's identify all of the stakeholders in this scenario. It's that we've been talking a lot about the vehicle manufacturers, but there's also the device makers. There are the app companies. There's a lot of players when it comes to this, and he really wanted to use the bully pulpit a little bit to try and compel these parties to figure out like that next way forward. And I think it will take that kind of willing coalition. When we had a chance to talk a little bit yesterday about the sort of information sharing and analysis apparatus that also known as an ISAC. And you've got a number of these globally. There are a few dozen, and it really is the place and the space where interested parties can get together to share, trying to solve for very specific challenges. And the one I'll get to in the case of the auto ISAC is very centered on cybersecurity. I think the growth of cyber incidents, the increase of vulnerabilities in around, say 2012, 2013, NHTSA had discovered that a Jeep could be hacked from the outside, that controls could be taken from an external party, bad actor. And, this has probably been a long time coming, but it was this startup group of not just automotive manufacturers. We're talking about telecommunications companies. We're talking about AI companies getting together. I think today there are 79, almost 80 of them, who get together as a sort of a sector, and in a almost anonymized way, share what they're seeing and share how they're mitigating and hardening. But that is with a focus specifically on that challenge
On cybersecurity.
on cybersecurity.
Yeah.
Now, can you repurpose? Can that specific group adopt, kind of a different agenda, or put them together, or do you have to spin off? Surely there are multiple ISACs for the same industry. Can you orient one around this question of safety? And a big part of that would be the data piece, would be And is there a minimum level of data that we can all agree on, right? And if we have to sort of scrub it in a way, right, for this for the sake of the driver, for the sake of pedestrians, um, and then for the sake of the brand of automotive driving, like they all have 40,000 hanging over their head at this point. Um, and they all put a lot into trying to increase safety in the best way possible. Uh, can that kind of group come together regularly to tackle this? And you can tackle it from the intersection. You can tackle it from the truck. You can tackle it from pedestrian. You can tackle it from a number of different angles. But it doesn't have to just be auto manufacturers trying to solve for this problem. Because I'll say, the earliest history, I mentioned this to you, uh, um, vehicle safety starts at the collapsible steering column, which in the early 70s, believe it or not, your steering column didn't collapse and it became basically a projectile on forward collision. When they figured that out, it had a huge effect and industry adopted it. And you take that through seatbelts and airbags and AEB and everything that we're talking about today. Um, looking off into the future, I even believe automated driving it's got to be one of the problems that's going to get solved on distraction can be solved with ADS technology, and it just needs to be perfected and adopted, and we need education around it. We can't call it what it's not. We can't confuse the public, but I think, there's a lot that can be shared in the form of a stakeholder group, in the form of an ISAC, where you can maybe share more information. It can be safety groups. It can be, right? It's kind of a coalition of willing who abide by a certain level of sort of, what's said here stays here. But we want to adopt the best practices for the sake of the traveling public in our own sector.
Yeah, and I think of this as problem-based research. Like we know what the problem is. We know it's distracted driving, or we know it's drunk driving. We know it's speed. Those seem to be the big factors in
Yep.
the 40,000 number. Um, and oddly enough, the cars are safer than they've ever been in many ways, with airbags and occupant protection and things like automatic emergency braking. Um, the When I think of ISACs, I think of it as a sandbox, and everybody comes in with a um, um, limiting the amount of information that can leave the sandbox, so people can sort of share their information in a safe way and maybe develop some consensus. And I also think of this as something where the proper coalition can make it easier for government to do its job.
Yep.
And because if we're looking for government to um, solve the problem, we're going to wait a long time, if
Yep.
ever that's going to happen. So I think coalitions that work in something like an ISAC that's specifically targeting real safety, especially with the amount of data that's coming off the cars now,
Yep.
um, we should be able to advance this discussion pretty quickly. We'll at
Yeah.
least understand objectively what's going on out there.
Yeah.
And wonder if you had any thoughts on
Well,
that.
and one piece of another dimension of this too, think about it, is what the government invests in and what the government invests from a infrastructure perspective, meaning, if this sandbox happens and part of the solution is a different road design or different technology adopted on the roadside or intersection, um, government is better enabled to make the decision of placing that investment in the right way based off of the input and the research of an outside body. Um, so I think that there is a lot of potential there, and I think in the case of AEB, in the case of auto ISAC, like you can get a lot of things done and not necessarily need the government to mandate to get it to become possible. And in the process, you're saving lives, and that feels like the most important thing. So, what levers do we have that can make us go quickly? Um, the age-old sort of conundrum that is, you've got technology needs to develop, and then if you want the government to guide that, mandate, well, now you're on government's time, right? Which is a very slow timeline, as you said, that can be disrupted. And technology just keeps changing and advancing. So this
Well,
is also another way.
well, I think this really becomes a call to action, and I think we need to identify those parties that are willing to participate in this conversation and in this exercise, and work on this problem-based research. And it's pretty easy to identify the problem, but really a lot of the hard work does go into identifying the problem well enough so that it can be tackled. But if you're inclined as a member of the audience, or somebody who's watching this after the fact, I'm going to encourage you to reach out to me, and my contact information is on the screen. And let's get the party started. And I think, developing an ISAC around mobility is at least worth the discussion. It doesn't necessarily have to result in that, but I've heard of no other way of it being done yet. And so we're going to have to develop a system where, well, let's face it, technology is going to continue to outrun our legal and regulatory system. About a year ago, when people started to realize artificial intelligence was a real thing, and one of the first things that happened when people were saying, well, we need a regulatory system to regulate artificial intelligence so it doesn't eat us. Well, that's not how a regulatory system is going to work. And we don't even know what artificial intelligence looks like yet. And yet we expect our government to step up and say, okay, here's the rules of the road on artificial intelligence. And so that's not the real world, as our discussions have shown today. A lot of the advancements in automotive safety didn't happen because government issued rules first and then everybody got in line. We had to come up with the common understanding of the problem and then start to think about how we could solve that with our own experience. And I do think the data part of this is crucial. And understandably, car manufacturers are reluctant to allow a lot of their data out into the real world. But we have to have an understanding first that that data is not owned by car manufacturers, therefore they can control it. There's certainly intellectual property aspects of it that they want to be careful about, and they're talking to competitors. And how they might use that data certainly has a proprietary aspect to it. But data coming off cars that explains how an accident happened should be made available to anybody who cares about what happened in an accident. What's a better way to understand an edge case? Is the edge case I'm talking about is an accident.
Hmm.
And if you can look at a failure and say what went wrong by looking at the
Hmm.
data, what better use of that data?
Yeah.
So I think
And
that,
Mike, are you seeing that as an attorney who is looking closely at this, that
yeah,
it's available, that it's,
it's this,
cooperative companies are making it available?
yeah, there's two companies that come to mind that clearly are making this data available. Tesla, the minute that car has an accident, that data is transported via modem up to a cloud. And then owners of those cars can, within 30 minutes, go to their portal and ask to have data and video shipped down to them. And it's usually available within an hour. And
Hmm.
it's dramatic what that data looks like. We're not talking about EDR data. We're talking about data that's being run through the car for functional purposes. And Rivian is doing the same thing, which I guess is not that much of a coincidence, since Rivian and Tesla have such a common uh, uh, creation. Not that they built each other, but they're certainly modeled after each other. But I do see other car manufacturers saying, no, you're not getting that data.
Hmm.
That's ours, or that's proprietary, or we'll share it with you only with a subpoena. And I think that dynamic has to change. And so, and oddly enough, when I was at MIT a couple of weeks ago, they had someone from the FAA show up and talk about how they solved airline crash problems, and that was with a higher degree of transparency and being able to understand what went wrong and how to address it so it didn't happen again. And that message came through loud and clear. So yeah, I do see car manufacturers have a role to play. They have to get past this idea that we might get sued. Um, you're going to get sued whether you share that data or you don't. But let's stop the accidents from happening by understanding them better.
Yeah,
Um,
that sounds right. Yeah, that
so
sounds right. And I know commercial aviation has done a really great job of kind of for the sake of their sector and the sake of the traveling public in the air. When I was a little kid, they kind of came out and said, we have to take a little bit different approach. So with that, we do have some created quite a stir in terms of questions, and I don't think I can get to everything, but got a few I would like to just kind of lob out there from our audience. The first is related to this topic on data. How and who can help with standardizing the data? If databases like the SGO are not comparing apples to apples, then solid analysis can't be done to help with getting to positive change for safety. So, Mike, I don't know what your first reaction to that is. I have one general reaction, and that is having worked closely enough with the folks who developed the SGO approach. Um, it was a first of its kind approach. Uh, it was, wasn't mandated by Congress to do that. So, going into developing a framework where, in an almost, I say volunteer, but in a compelling enough way, get information from manufacturers to flag it and tag it as the different levels, ADAS versus ADS, and then you're kind of faced with and they say apples to apples, but you're faced with the quality of the data going in and being provided is as good as the provider that's giving it. So I know SGO learned from, or I should say NHTSA, learned from SGO 1.0, and the idea was to refresh to a 2.0. And I thought that was a practical approach and one that provided a lot of maneuverability for federal government, for a federal government that when we only talk about regulations and requirements and mandates and the process that goes into that, this was a more nimble way of starting to attract that information and get that information.
yeah, but even the standing general order says, tell us when you've had an accident involving ADAS. Um, this is a little bit of a war story, but this also shows how this can be handled wrongly. I was in the offices of a major auto manufacturer a couple of years ago, and I said, how many accidents have you reported? And the attorney in the room sheepishly looked and said, one. And I went, come
Yeah.
on, one? So, uh, yeah, and we're, you know, um, NHTSA can only do so much with that. And then it's not public information, and it's
Right.
not getting in the hands of people that can really do some good with it.
Right.
Uh, I also think, the standardization question, fantastic question, but I think that's easy to solve because that's where you would get people like-minded. I mean, there's some work that's done on EDR, just so people understand. EDR data is relatively small compared to what we're talking about, and it doesn't deal with automation in any way. So
Yeah.
there's some talk about creating a data logger, but that that's earmarked for when we get to level 3, 4, and 5, which is a little bit late to the party. So do you have any more questions that we're putting on the table?
Yeah, so there is a question, a little bit. It's about almost like the aftermarket, the ability to disable AEB in vehicles. What I can say is that the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, the FMVSS, require vehicles to be built to a type specification, including on safety features. Uh, we see it's not just the disabling of AEB, but think of anybody that does anything to their vehicle that you know didn't come off the line looking the way it did or acting the way it did. This sort of falls into that atmosphere as well. And the question is, do you feel it's a good idea to not let a driver disable a feature that provides automated control over the one of the most vital safety components of the vehicle, the brakes? Um, if I'm asking if I agree that you should be able to disable that, I don't think you should be able to disable that. I think it's there for a reason, for a purpose. Um, but Mike, get your thoughts on that as well. You probably agree.
Yeah, I don't understand this mindset. And the no disrespect to whoever asked that question. It's almost like a libertarian kind of view of I have the right to decide how to drive my car. But that automatic emergency braking is not protecting only you, it's protecting the occupants in the car, and it's protecting people in other vehicles and other pedestrians. So we have a contract when we drive these cars with society to do it in a reasonable way. And um, there's no question that automatic emergency braking saves lives, and to disable it just sounds crazy.
Yeah, and I think the spirit of the question is wondering why NHTSA or the federal government would allow that to happen. Like, how could anybody disable that or want to disable that? I think in your point is some people just, whether it's, the rate of haptic, the rate of, braking, the, neck brake versus, is it a hassle? Like people will try to figure out a way to get around that. Um,
Well, let me address that a little bit, and I think maybe this is where the question's coming from. Um, a well-documented study that came out of the Department of Transportation in 2015 was done in conjunction with a number of universities and along with NHTSA. Depending on the circumstance, it takes about 2 seconds for someone to say, "Oh my God, I'm about to have a problem," so that they can then come up with a plan and then to take over. Putting all those events together, oh my God, here's my plan, and execution plan is about 7 seconds, where automatic emergency braking is happening a lot quicker than any of that. So I don't see someone saying, well, it's almost like this idea that I don't wear seatbelts because I don't want to be trapped in my car in the event of an accident.
yeah.
When science is and data has shown quite clearly you're much more likely to die if you're not belted in your car.
Yeah. If I could, building off that, if you take the idea of, and maybe let's just call it it's almost like a community of practice, what the ISAC represents. But if that is a phenomenon that people are disabling safety features, safety features, that could be a space, a safe space to say, well, okay, which vehicles? And how is it being done? Is there a way to harden that component a little bit better? Is there a different right because this is a requirement? Uh, it's almost like, to take it to the more ridiculous, uh, would be, okay, I don't like to stop, so I'm going to just take my brake pads off, right? Um, Now, the universe isn't doing that, thankfully, but there has to be a point where maybe somebody says, okay, this is an issue similar to the cybersecurity element of the auto ISAC. Let's find the issue and let's kind of reverse engineer our way to where it's happening, why it's happening, and then think about the universal fix that we can all agree on and implement tomorrow because we're the private industry. And as long as it complies with FMVSS, then we can go beyond, right? What's a safety feature, right? And that's one of the things that's kind of a rub is you get a safety feature develop that shows real world life-saving gains. And if it's not compelled by the FMVSS, then it's sort of a luxury. And we shouldn't be thinking about these things as luxuries, like who gets to stand a chance at a forward collision versus who doesn't.
Right.
So I think that's a space where you can kind of bubble these types of ideas up.
We got time for one more question, I think, Vin.
Okay, well, I have one here that's it's a little out of my element, but I think because you're the lawyer and you've been studying this, I want to sort of put it out there. And they ask if people can upload dash cam footage directly to law enforcement. This could change behavior if people think they can be watched and reported by their fellow drivers. This has worked well in the United Kingdom. Um, Interesting. Uh, I have actually personally had the challenge of wanting to videotape somebody doing something really blatantly illegal, but while I'm driving, I am not going to pick up my phone to videotape it, right? So I am caught in my own sort of cycle, if you will. But this is actually quite interesting to think about. And I don't know, I guess it sort of falls in like the law enforcement side, the what's being enforced.
Yeah, first off, your car is recording everything anyway. And 100% of the cars that are being sold in the US fleet right now have embedded modems. Most of those modems are 5G. So the amount of data coming off a car, including video, um, is there and useful and available for these reasons. It doesn't have to be something that you download. But sure, I've seen people download those videos. I've seen a road rage accident where this person claimed that they were rear-ended when actually they got angry for some reason, ripped around the car they were angry at, and then jammed on their brakes, and then got hit in the rear, and originally was claiming injuries, and then the the innocent party here, took the dash cam, showed it to the police officer, and the person was immediately arrested and led away from the scene. So yeah, that the dash cam stuff can help, but we're not going to need that. That the cameras are recording. It's more a function of making that information available,
Yeah.
and now understanding how to do it. So I would implore anybody who's listening to be more aware of what the capabilities of the car are, and also to really push to have your data made available to you. That's incredibly important for accident issues, but also for personal safety. But I think you'd be surprised how much of that's already out there. Um, I'm just going to make this point one more time. We need your organizations to be part of the solution. And we're building a coalition of mobility professionals to help build safer and smarter transportation. And I'm going to ask you to reach out if you're one of those, and I hope you are. And would appreciate you letting us know if you have an interest in becoming a much more included part of the conversation. Vin, I think that's all the time we have. You've been fantastic to work with on this. I knew you would be,
Thank
and
you.
I hope you join us
Likewise.
again. And you have this depth of understanding that very few people have. And for the audience members, want to thank you again for joining us for what is now our third. We'll have our fourth in the last week in June. So look for a date and time reminder to be coming out soon. With that, wish everybody a safe and happy summer. And thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Mike.